According to Mr. Alexander's book and emails from his friends Sky and Chris Hughes, Mr. Alexander came from a very abusive family that not only included extreme physical abuse, but parents who were addicted to meth, parents who were extremely neglectful to him and his siblings, parents who were violent with each other, and in fact, a mother who had, according to Mr. Alexander...
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Were you going to... Judge, there was no hearsay. May we approach?
You may.
You may continue. Ms. LaViolette, without telling us specifically what words were spoken, did you get an impression from what Mr. Alexander said about how his mother verbally treated them?
Yes.
And what was that impression?
That it was extremely verbally abusive, words strung together that you wouldn't hear on the street, and that it was particularly directed at him and his sisters.
You were asked questions about the fact that you don't have a PhD, right?
Yes, yes.
And in fact, I think the question was posed to you that you stopped your education. Do you remember that?
Yes.
You actually haven't stopped your education, have you?
No.
Tell us what education you are currently, or you've been getting.
Well, as a marriage family therapist, you have to have 36 continuing education units every 2 years, and I generally get more than that, and that can be on a variety of things. And as a person who works in domestic violence with perpetrators, I have to have 16 continuing education units every year that reflect at least 8 hours on domestic violence and 8 hours on a field that connects with domestic violence. So it winds up being that they can be overlapping, so you don't have to get 16 plus 18 every year. But this year I have about 50, I think.
50, you said?
50 CEUs.
All right. That's continuing education?
Yes.
And besides that, what about you were also asked questions about whether or not you were really just a counselor, right?
Yes.
Do you counsel people?
Yes, I do.
Are you proud to counsel people?
Yeah.
What about, but do you have a license to do what you do?
I do have a license. I have what's called a marriage family therapy license. It's also called psychotherapist. It can be different in different states. There are some states that call folks with a master's degree counselors, and they have a license. It's different in different states.
All right. What does it take to get that license?
It takes, you have to do 3,000 hours of supervised counseling. That can include your own counseling as well. When I took the test, you had to take a 4-hour oral exam, and then you had to do a 4-hour written exam, and then an oral exam that at that time included a case that they gave you that was sort of spontaneously put to you, where you had to tell them how you would handle the case, and then you had to bring your own case and describe a case you'd worked on and how you'd handled it.
All right, and does that, getting a license, is that different than being a counselor?
Yes.
And is it because you have to get this license?
Yes.
And all the time that you have to put into to get it?
Yes.
And how long have you had this license?
Since 1992.
You also were asked questions about testing, right? Psychological testing?
Correct.
And I think it's been pretty clear. Do you ever give psychological tests?
No, I don't.
Have you ever in the past?
Yes, when I was an undergraduate at the Veterans Hospital.
Okay. And so what year was that?
1968, 1969.
Okay. So is that, you don't do that anymore, right?
No, you're not allowed to do it unless you have a specialty, but because I was a student and that was part of my training, they actually trained me to give several tests and to score several tests back at that time. Once I graduated, I could no longer do it.
All right. And do you work with doctors who do give these types of tests?
I have consulted on particularly child custody evaluations where the tests are given and we read over the tests together, but I'm not an expert on testing.
All right. With regard to the testing, you had said in answer to one of the questions that the state asked you or the prosecutor asked you that psychological tests are subjective. Do you remember that?
There's a subjectivity to them, yes.
What do you mean?
Well, depending on the tests that are given, for instance, a lot of people have heard of the Rorschach ink blot test. And that's a test where you see ink blots and you kind of describe what's there. And common answers are listed and you're kind of scored according to that. So I would consider that subjective. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, is given to lots of people. If you're test smart, you know how to do it. There's a faking score on it, but a lot of people take that test and have some test wiseness and are able to do it. In addition, when you look at, for instance, in child custody evaluations, there's a caveat that says this test could be this could be the result of a normal person under stress or somebody who's really, wacky. So there are caveats with the test and caveats that basically say the testing shouldn't be done just on its own, that you want the rest of that clinical interview and corroborative data with it.
And do you remember being asked questions about your CV?
Yes.
Do you know offhand how long your CV is? How many pages?
It's over 20, but I don't know how long, and it's not completely up to date.
Okay. You were just shown one page of your CV. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And it was in conjunction with talking about whether or not you were a keynote speaker or a featured speaker.
Yes.
And that was the only thing that you were asked about with regard to your CV, right?
Correct.
And with regard to whether or not you were a keynote speaker or whether you're not a featured speaker, is one more important than the other?
Well, a keynote speaker is somebody at a conference that sort of is supposed to energize the group either in the morning. Sometimes it happens in the morning, sometimes it happens at lunch, sometimes there's one at the end of the day too, sometimes there are numerous keynote speakers, but the keynote speaker has a lot of responsibility because they have a short time to speak and they're supposed to get the group going with that keynote. So it's considered a coup to be a keynote speaker.
Okay, what about a featured speaker?
Featured speaker, the difference is when I'm a featured speaker, I can be speaking for 2 days, and I might be the only speaker, or I might be featured as a speaker in a conference, something like that. So it's really important. You could be the only person that's speaking, but it's different in terms of responsibility, and also as a featured speaker, you get more time. Whereas a keynote speaker, you usually get anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour.
All right. With the line of questioning with regard to the keynote speaker or a featured speaker, there's the implication that you were somehow not being truthful by listing a Snow White, a talk about, not about Snow White, but is Snow White a Battered Woman, the title of the talk, whether or not that should have been listed in the keynote versus featured speaker. Do you have any concerns that you were not honest about where that should have been noted?
No.
And that was the only thing that was talked to you about your CV?
Yes.
I want to talk to you about some of the questions you had with regard to how you assess domestic violence relationships, okay?
Okay.
There was a lot of questions about that. Let's talk about patterns.
All right.
And what patterns mean to you in your assessment of relationships.
Well, when you're dealing with domestic violence, you're not dealing with isolated acts. You're dealing with acts that occur over time. They can increase in frequency and intensity. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's sort of a leveling off and people just use about the same level. But the general pattern is that over time they increase in intensity and frequency. And that what you want to look at is the mood that's created in that relationship. That, for instance, if you were depressed, and even if you were depressed for a week, and somebody said to you, how did you feel during that period of time? You might say, depressed, even though you had a good day, or you had a good period of time. So the idea is that over time in domestic violence, it creates a mood in this relationship. And the mood tends to have apprehension in it. It tends to have a certain amount of oppression. And so people are greatly affected in this kind of situation. And it doesn't have to be physical. It can be verbal, emotional, kinds of things that happen. But what we usually think of in regard to domestic violence is physical abuse. But I talk to so many people who are psychologically abused and talk about that as being one of the worst things that can happen to them. Talk about the control, the way they feel controlled, and talk about the way that's minimized next to physical abuse, because most of media portrayals are about severe physical abuse and don't take as much of a look at psychological and verbal abuse.
Much of the questions that you were asked by the prosecutor wanted you to look at just one statement or one specific act. Is that useful to you, to just look at one statement and then make an assessment based off of one thing, one statement or one act?
I can't do that because any of us could have a bad day. Any of us could have a time where we said something that wasn't very kind to somebody we loved. You really have to look at more of a bigger picture where that goes.
All right. You were asked questions about the women that Mr. Alexander was communicating with being vulnerable. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So talking about patterns, did you see a pattern with regard to this?
Yes, I did.
What kind of pattern is it?
That in general, these women were either married, so they would be considered in some way cheating.
Based on the content of the instant messages that you read?
Right.
Or text messages?
They were much younger than Mr. Alexander. They were single parents. They were Mormon women who certainly wouldn't want to be seen as less than chaste or admirable. And in addition to that, they were women who could be pushed on and go along with it. Because the women that were pushed on, there were women who were pushed on and didn't go along with it. So they were women who were vulnerable enough to go on once they were pushed into sexual conversation, who were women that were able to be pushed in that direction.
Because of whatever type of vulnerability they had?
Yes.